Vladimir Putin replied last night to the ceasefire proposal from Volodymyr Zelensky that has been brokered by the United States and the Trump administration. However, if you read through the semantic language that he used, it's clear there will be no ceasefire unless Ukraine capitulates. So what does that mean for the Russo-Ukrainian war and the prospects of peace going forward? Привет! My name is Connor Klein, I'm an expert in international relations, and I'm here to give you a more insightful and unique perspective on the happenings of the Russo-Ukrainian war. So, 2 days ago I made a video when I outlined that basically Vladimir Putin had four choices in how to reply to the ceasefire proposal brokered by the United States that the Ukrainian delegation had agreed to at some talks in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. And Vladimir Putin went for numero uno, the option of rejecting the ceasefire and making more demands. And these demands are that the underlying problems to the conflict are resolved in order for there to be a ceasefire. And according to the Russian side, the underlying problem is basically that Ukraine is independent of Moscow, that if you think back to when Vladimir Putin made his de facto declaration of war speech a few days before the February 24th, 2022 invasion, he outlined several terms and conditions for his launching of the invasion, the impending invasion, and one of them was to denazify Ukraine, which is basically a code word to mean regime change and having a pro-Moscow president in Kyiv. On top of that, he wanted demilitarization. It's basically that Ukraine has no military, no capability to defend itself from future or to deter future Russian aggression and invasions. For example, say there was a pro-Russian president and then that pro-Russian president was overthrown in Ukraine, like in 2014 with the Maidan Revolution, then Ukraine will be in a very weak position to actually resist a new Russian invasion, to install presumably a new pro-Russian leader. So those are two of the key demands, and Vladimir Putin actually made some reference to them in his speech yesterday, where he said that the ceasefire shouldn't be used for the Ukrainians basically to be able to rearm or retrain or rotate troops, and also that the small piece of Russian territory that's still under Ukrainian control in the Kursk Oblast, that basically those soldiers there surrendered to Russia and they were treated as terrorists, and that seems like a code word for basically being summarily executed if you see what's been going on in the Russian Z-vloggers, where they've been circulating images of Ukrainian POWs that have been apparently murdered in captivity after they surrendered, obviously a war crime in the Kursk Oblast. So pretty unacceptable stuff if you're looking at it from the Ukrainian point of view. Why would the Ukrainians basically surrender to Russia in order to get a ceasefire? And that is more or less what I expected Vladimir Putin to do on balance. It wasn't entirely clear a couple of days ago. He could have just agreed to a ceasefire and then broken it and said, yeah, I haven't blamed the Ukrainians. That was also a possibility, I felt. But he's gone for the first option, which is basically to say politely no. He said that a ceasefire is basically would be a very interesting idea if Ukraine were to basically capitulate to Russian demands, and he is going to basically look to see if he can get more concessions out of the new Trump administration. Will they put pressure now on Ukraine to give in to Russia's demands, to a certain extent at least, to maybe get a ceasefire going forward? In that ceasefire proposal, actually, Ukraine did put some stipulations like exchange of POWs, and most importantly, that Russia returns the large number of children that they have abducted from Ukraine since the beginning of 2022. If you think back to 2022, Vladimir Putin is actually indicted by the International Criminal Court because of these abductions. He's been very open about it, that they removed these children. And that is why he is actually wanted by the ICC. Technically that could also be interpreted as part of a genocide. It's a little bit legally unclear because a lot of the elements to the genocide convention are present in all wars. So it's about basically mens rea, or the guilty mind, and the intention to a certain extent, whether that would be fall under the definition of genocide or not. However, it is a war crime in any case to remove so many people from one group that you're occupying and basically try to assimilate them into your own culture. And yeah, I think for most people it looks pretty clear that it would be kidnapping. Russians interpret it as they are saving these children by basically removing their identity and trying to Russify them. So by putting those conditions into the ceasefire proposal, Zelensky basically had set it up that almost certainly Putin would reject it because he was not going to, almost certainly not going to hand over those children. In particular, POW is probably also not likely to happen, that there would be such a mass exchange of prisoners that Russia would agree to, but that was a little bit more likely. But the exchange of children basically was a way of Ukraine making it very difficult for Vladimir Putin to accept it. And the Putin government is obviously going to insist on its original maximalist war aims as currently the terms for having a ceasefire. So what can we say going forward in the next few weeks? How will the Trump administration react? Well, they cut off military support for Ukraine. They've already cut off the financial aid, and they blinded the Ukrainians with respect to satellite and intel just before Russia seized a large part of the Sudzha pocket, I guess we can call it, the part of the Kursk Oblast that Ukraine had been controlling. There was a town there, the main town was Sudzha, and that has actually now been retaken by the Russians. So could be that Russia just anticipated that Ukraine would lose access to intel and new weapons, but more importantly the intel, and then we would have more of an advantage in terms of surprise, because nowadays with such good satellite and intel coverage, it is quite hard to have a surprise attack. So maybe the Russians were just waiting for their chance. And of course, this was announced in public that US had cut off the intel and Mazar were not allowed to send satellite images. So the Russians presumably just took their opportunity and grabbed that piece of territory. So is the Trump administration now going to react in the same way by trying to put more pressure on Ukraine by cutting off their intel again, and maybe that would help Russia take back all of the Kursk Oblast and make more progress in Ukraine? Or are they going to actually put a lot of pressure on Russia this time to try and get Russia to compromise and lower its demands and agree to a ceasefire? We will see in the coming days and weeks. So far, the new Trump administration hasn't given me a lot of cause for optimism with respect to how they will deal with the Russo-Ukrainian war. So far, they've basically given up a lot of bargaining chips with the Russian government, like no NATO admission for Ukraine, that Ukraine has to give up its territory, at least a significant part of its territory that's currently under occupation. So with that mindset, and these were given up basically before we even get to a ceasefire. And we also had that remarkable shakedown of Vladimir Zelensky in the Oval Office about 2 weeks ago. So I'm not going to be particularly optimistic that Trump and his administration is suddenly going to turn the screws on Russia, since so far they have been very pro-Kremlin in their approach. But we will wait and see in the next week or two if they change their tact after Vladimir Zelensky's agreement to a ceasefire of sorts, and then Vladimir Putin's very polite rejection of it. So let me know what you think down in the comments about the ceasefire proposal, what you think the prospects for peace are. I gave a live stream on my lifestyle channel about 3 weeks ago at this point, I think, and maybe it was only 2. And I rated the chances for a ceasefire in 2025 at between 30 and 40%, and the chance for long-term peace at this point as being close to 0. So let me know what you think in light of what has happened in the last week or two, whether we are closer or further away from, firstly, a ceasefire, and secondly, long-lasting peace in Ukraine. So leaving that note, do побачення.